probably received emails from me or we've spoken on the phone. So I'm delighted that you're here this evening, and even more delighted that we have our second Civics book group and we have our board chair, Ms. Liza Morehouse, here to welcome all of you. So without any further ado, Liza.
Well, thank you, Debbie, and happy New Year to everyone. Oops, oh, my paper's covering me, sorry. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, Debbie, so much for all of your work and thoughtfulness in making all of the arrangements and the plans. You're remarkable. Welcome, everyone, to Morven's Civics book discussion. As we would begin, I would like to acknowledge the influence and generosity of our benefactor, Betty Wold Johnson, who inspired us in a large way to start this program. And I'll just simply say, thank you, Betty, this is for you. It's wonderful to be together with everyone to share ideas and insights. And I'm very grateful to John Baxter for taking on the task of leading us. And I look forward to an interesting and robust discussion. It's a great book to discuss. But first, I do have to say that the news of the day has been ringing loudly around us for weeks now. And while I know we should not ignore the alarming anniversary of extreme actions and disturbing unrest, I truly feel we should neither let it claim all our energy and attention. Having this book as our discussion topic is timely, I think largely because we will find in it great solace that similar events and worse have been cataloged in our past, but our institutions held strong. By reading Mr. Meacham's work, which examines our former leaders as they make both sound and faulty decisions, we can have faith in what he proposes in his introduction. And I quote, "If the men and women of the past, with all their flaws and limitations and appetites, could press on through ignorance and superstition, racism and sexism, selfishness and greed, to create a freer, stronger nation, then perhaps we too can right wrongs and take another step toward that most enchanting and elusive of destinations, a more perfect union." End quote. And with that, I welcome you to this evening's program. And I hand it over to Debbie and John.
Thank you so much, Liza. I am very excited to be able to welcome John Baxter once again to be with us. And he is a wonderful historian, author, and a most beloved, here he is in a little photo there, most beloved former Princeton High School history, social studies, every kind of civics-minded subject teacher. So he's going to lead us through our discussion today. So without any further ado, Mr. John Baxter.
Thank you, Liza. Thank you, Debbie, and welcome everybody. And yes, Happy New Year. If we could just go back to that picture of Mr. Baxter in the old days there. Debbie, could you go back to that previous slide? I just want to add on to that quote, because reading it now, this book that we're about to discuss tonight, I think does give us, through history, a meaning to the life of our nation. I think that's largely what this book is about. So it is one of the ways that history gives us a sense of meaning. So without further ado, going on to the next slide. This is a book. It received a glowing reception, reviews. This one caught my attention since the reviewer, Mr. Boston, said that anyone who succeeds in condensing and deriving lessons from the guts of American history in fewer than 300 pages is demonstrating synthesizing powers bordering on the supernatural. I said, wow, I have to share that. And I hope that everybody who had a chance to read the book, whether you're able to read all of it or not, got a sense for why he received those words of praise. I would also note that Mr. Meacham is an advisor to current President Joe Biden. And if you heard the president's address earlier today, you would have felt like you were reading the right book. because he spoke of the soul of the country, the soul of America, and no doubt Mr. Meacham was whispering in his ears or in his ear and had some role in that speech that he delivered. So that's the book we'll be discussing tonight, our second meeting. And here's just a little bit of an outline of how we'll approach it. It is, it is a full-length book, even if it is praiseworthy for being able to do so much in so few pages. It's still a lot to discuss. So just to lay out a little bit of what we'll be doing, just to make sure we're all on the same page with regard to what we mean by the American soul and her better angels, and what is this constant perennial historical battle that Meacham writes about? What are the causes? Who are the targets? Why the presidency? Why the focus on the presidency together with we the people? Meacham makes the point repeatedly that it's when the voice of the people is heard by the powerful, particularly by the president, that change happens. We will be going through it chapter by chapter, not too strictly. Some chapters get a little bit more attention than others, but by all means, what I hope we will do, as we've done in the past, at least in our first meeting, is if everyone would share what they found interesting, what they learned as we're going through the book, that would be terrific. Hopefully we'll take just about an hour for our meeting. So we have to move rather rapidly, but at the end of our formal discussion, we'll open it up for question and answer and further discussion. Okay. So let's get on to, although the next slide will address the better angels of our nature. Of course, that comes from Lincoln's first inaugural, March 4th of 1861. Those are perhaps the most eloquent and the most often repeated words from any political speech in our country. Before we talk about what is meant by the better angels, there's the question of what is the soul of America. And I think Meacham would say the soul is the essence of America. It's the life of the country, its creed, its beliefs. And the soul, of course, is just as with the individual, made up of both the good and the bad. And the better angels of our nature is the better side, obviously, compared to the darker side, which will be that ongoing battle that he'll write about. The better angels, if we're talking about the creed of the country, of course, that comes from the Declaration of Independence and those opening lines of Thomas Jefferson. I'm not going to read this. We'll see the preamble to the Constitution. I won't read that either. But just as Meacham shares that wonderful story about Truman, where he reads to a woman the Bill of Rights to point out that indeed our Constitution is colorblind. When he's reading that, and he says, it's not a bad thing for all of us to read the Bill of Rights from time to time. So certainly he was speaking to something that I often would say to students: you have to go back to the text. So I won't read it, but I encourage you to go back and take a look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in the days ahead. But certainly the next page, the next slide, these are the watchwords that we get both from the Declaration of Independence as well as from Meacham's interpretation of better angels, not only egalitarian, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but also democratic, which isn't necessarily something that the founding fathers had in mind, and also that it's welcoming and generous, and how those words of Thomas Jefferson end up being expanded by future generations as more welcoming, more generous, more expansive in the words and interpreting the words of those documents. And then on the other side, there's the dark side. This comes from Sean Rolentz's review of the book, which was also very positive. But he points out, what is the dark side is that this continuing history of another abiding element of the American soul, what Meacham would refer to as our worst instincts or impulses, the dark side. And Meacham would add to it, not only would he say absolutist, oligarchic, anti-egalitarian, demagogic, and always racist, but he would add to that xenophobia, and basically one that is driven by fear. So that's the ongoing struggle in the American soul between the better angels and the darker side. I would, just to go back, and as we go forward, Meacham largely leaves the connections between the history and today's events, leaves the connections up to the reader to make those connections. So as we go through this, we want to stick with the text and stick with the book and leave those connections to some discussion perhaps later on in the evening. Certainly there are connections to be drawn. I'm sure everyone picked up on many of those, but they're connections not only in the sense of similarities, but also absences, things that happened in the past that we're not experiencing in these days. But the President of the United States clearly, very much on all of our minds currently, those powers of the president spelled out, I think it's maybe 20% of the Constitution deals with the President of the United States. It's a rather brief article compared to Article 1, which is about the legislature. And we're familiar with certain powers, the commander-in-chief, pardons, treaties, judges of the Supreme Court. But it's the opening words of Article 2 that Meacham refers to. If we could go to that next slide. The executive power, these are the opening words. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. And Meacham, on page 26 of the book, he refers to the founding fathers as not being very clear, right? Really drafting something that certainly was new. This is a new type of power in government as of 1787. But he says that yet they, referring to the framers, were willing to live with ambiguity. And this is that ambiguity. And of course, there's ambiguity just about what does commander-in-chief mean or war powers, but the executive power, right? That power is invested in this one individual whose formal title is President of the United States. What exactly does that encompass? And it's been expanded over time. But Meacham also goes on, not only were they willing to live with an ambiguity, that they created ambiguity, but they also were wagering on human character, the person who would fill this office. And the reason they were willing to do that was because the person who they knew was going to fill this office was the person who was already being referred to as president. As they sat there in Philadelphia, he was the president of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, of course, George Washington. So they could be comfortable with at least those first 4 years or more. So on the one hand, we have the presidency, and if you were able to watch the video mandate about how the presidency expanded over time. Certainly we the people, the other part of the equation, again, Meacham talks about change occurring when the voice of the people is heard by the powerful, and particularly the powerful who have the skills, the power of government, and also the skills of government to respond. So the other part of the equation is the people. And here is that preamble, when we say the people, we always think of the opening words of the preamble of the Constitution, we the people. And just as with the Declaration of Independence and the expansion of the idea of all men created equal, so too, who are the people? Who are the ones who have a voice? This is the creation of the Constitution, the creation of the government. Who are the people who not only have representation, but to whom the government is listening? And as we all know, the people who have the vote, those would be the people who are most likely to be listened to. So this too, the idea of the people expands over time. The Shadow of Appomattox, chapter 2 of the book. Meacham, as I'm sure you read, started this book in response to the events of Charlottesville in August of 2017. So if ever there was an event that speaks to the long shadow of Appomattox, the Civil War, it was that event in Charlottesville just a couple of years ago. You might remember that that event, that march that took place there, was due to the fact that they were removing a statue of Robert E. Lee from the park. So this, the long shadow of Appomattox and how long it has taken to fulfill the hopes of at least of the Union, at least some of the Union from the Civil War. This quote caught my attention because it's from William Lloyd Garrison. And Garrison here is expressing skepticism about why political equality would accompany the end of slavery. Garrison, he was a leading abolitionist. In 1830, 1831, he creates the American Anti-Slavery Society. So here, the resistance to full equality, full freedom, full membership in the civic political body, even is being questioned by William Lloyd Garrison. Now, on the other hand, you have Lincoln making his last speech the following year. Garrison is speaking in 1864. 1865, just days after the surrender of Lee, Lincoln, from the window of the second floor of the White House, delivers his last speech. And towards the end of that speech, this is a speech about Reconstruction. It's a speech about Louisiana coming back into the Union. At the very end of that speech, he refers to giving the franchise to the colored man. That is, so the story goes, that is the line of the speech that is heard by one in the audience, John Wilkes Booth, that then pushes him to the point of going forward with the assassination of Lincoln. But Lincoln also says, I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and those who served our cause as soldiers. So even Lincoln, while he is advocating for the expansion of, or the enfranchisement of the colored man, is putting a caveat that was not applied to white men. Under the age of Jackson, by the 1840s, you have universal white male suffrage in the United States, and no literacy tests. So fast forward now into Reconstruction. And this is the ratification of the 15th Amendment, where that idea that Lincoln introduced in 1865 actually is put into the Constitution. And Grant, this is also a striking quote, that he says, the 15th Amendment is a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day. Now, you would think the 13th Amendment, I mean, this is a pretty remarkable statement, But I think what Grant is getting at is this has to do with our political body of we the people. It's not just about liberation. And he goes on in his remarks to say that to the race more favored heretofore, to the white people, to the white men who have been favored by our laws, I would say withhold no legal privilege of advancement to the new citizen. And that, the 15th Amendment, 1870, up until the 26th Amendment, which is in 1971, in those 100 years, you have, we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. If you take out the Bill of Rights, these amendments represent more than half of the amendments post-Civil War. And each one of these amendments in different ways expands democracy, either by expanding suffrage with the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, the 20th Amendment, which shortens the lame duck period so that the people get the president that they want sooner than March, January 20th. The 22nd Amendment really protects our democracy from autocracy in putting limits, term limits on the presidency, 2 terms or 10 years. 23rd Amendment gives electoral votes to Washington, D.C., so those people have a say in the president. And the 24th, which eliminates prohibits poll taxes. And then the 26th with the 18-year-olds. So expansion of democracy has really been, while it may not have been something that the founders anticipated, really has become part of the soul of America. Chapter 4, gotta love the title, wish this for us more often, a new and good thing in the world. Speaking about expanding the suffrage to 50% of the population, to women, and that leadership came from those without office. Right? The political power of women who were essentially powerless and what they were able to achieve, a new nation. And it goes back to the founding, Abigail Adams. And this is a great quote, and it's a great quote because it is a very, it's right out of the Declaration of Independence, even though she's writing it before. This is probably in May of 1776, so it hasn't been drafted yet. But she is hitting the main point that we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And so, but that's in 1776, you'll have the Women's Conference in Seneca Falls, 76 years later, I believe it is, in 1848. And then finally, in 1919, we get the 19th Amendment. And Wilson, Meacham makes the point that one of the things that is associated with some of the greatest moments in our history is when a president changes his mind. One day, hopefully we'll say her mind. But here Wilson does change. I think not only the book, but especially the documentary of the book does a wonderful job about the strategy of Alice Paul, the daily standing in front of the White House and bringing this movement right to the doorsteps of the White House. It was a two-pronged strategy where they were trying to change the laws because many of these laws are state laws that are involved. And there's also the possibility of a national constitutional amendment, which is a difficult process. And Alice Paul made it her job, and she led the effort to get the constitutional amendment. But that fact of the importance of states for both good and bad, we can sometimes lose sight of that. But I think in the recent history, if I can just make one quick connection, the passage of laws infringing upon or curtailing voting rights is a state by state by state phenomenon that we're experiencing. And of course, the Voting Rights Act currently in Congress is one that's getting a lot of attention. And I think the president spoke to that as well. Meacham will remind us that this history is not just one-sided, and we move forward happily from decade to decade. He's fond, I think, of pointing out after something positive, the other side, as he puts it, and yet. So while the women were successful when they marched, and they had that march the day before Wilson's inauguration, as well as a number of times through those years leading up to the 19th Amendment, they were segregated. They did not allow Black women to march with them. Segregation, white supremacy was still very much a fact. Eugenics was another issue that Theodore Roosevelt would grapple with. But here we have the movie, The Birth of a Nation. One participant brought up the issue of social media and the internet, and how that is challenging for our society today. Well, this was a breakthrough. The being able to reach the public in ways that was not possible before, in powerful ways, right? Not just the voice over the radio, but the images that would go along with it in the movie theaters. And this would have a dramatic effect upon the rise of the second KKK. Here you see the statistics from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So during Reconstruction, and I should have pointed out in terms of and yet, in terms of Reconstruction, in terms of the Civil War, the war was won, slavery was ended. The amendments, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments were passed, and yet Reconstruction was lost. And it was lost largely because of that 500,000 individuals, the power of the KKK, together with just the loss of political will on the part of the North. And finally, in 1877, with the compromise following the contested election of 1876, where the federal government just retreated from the southern states, and the southern states put back in place what they would call their redeemer governments. So you have that large participation in KKK in 1871, and then just puts that to shame, the second Klan of the 1920s. It wanes for a number of reasons. One of the kind of the what ifs of American history, particularly with the 1930s, when we were facing the crisis of that decade, what would have happened had the numbers of the Klan been as high as 1925? 1925 is when you had that march of some 50,000 Klan members right down Pennsylvania Avenue. Meacham refers to that group as a broad-based racist army. And he wondered, in one interview, he wondered what would have happened had that type of Klan membership been available as the ground troops to some of the forces that would be at play in the 1930s with FDR. but it does wane less than 300,000 by the time we get to President Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, Meacham makes the point that he embodied recovery. He was the right president at the right time, the right man for the job, the right man for the office at the time. And he makes the point that reaction is no barrier to the radical. It is a challenge, a provocation. And that was part of what made Roosevelt a great president, is his character and his style. But he doesn't react. He doesn't, but he does outmaneuver. And Meacham refers to the dark side as the American tradition of white populists. And FDR had his hands full with populists, Huey Long, Father Charles Coughlin, and Charles Lindbergh, the most well-known and the ones addressed in the book. But populists, we often hear that phrase. Sometimes it's really just a style where one claims to speak for the people. In other instances, it's really the belief that the system just no longer works. And populist leaders speak to those fears. They raise the specter of some force that is undermining all that the people hold dear and familiar. These men, Huey Long, Charles Coughlin, certainly anti-Semitism, Charles Lindbergh, the American First movement. FDR had to deal with their presence and their influence, and certainly with Lindbergh and to a lesser extent Coughlin. They may have, I'm hearing myself, kept us out of World War II a little longer than would have been best. Okay, next slide. Okay, we've gotten to LBJ. If we just go back for a moment, Debbie, to the previous slide.
I'm trying to.
No, okay, we'll stay there. We'll come back to those points when we have our discussion. When we get to LBJ in the 1960s, we have here, when Meacham speaks of the voice of the people intersecting with the powerful, particularly the president, particularly a skillful president. LBJ certainly had those skills. And the voice of the people, of course, had the most amazing of voices with Martin Luther King Jr. But today we talk a lot about the filibuster, at least we hear a lot about the filibuster. This both speaks to the fact that, yes, the filibuster can be changed, and also speaks to the remarkable feat of LBJ in that he was facing the need to get 67 votes to invoke cloture and to move to a vote on any act. So his feat was truly proved himself to be a master of the Senate, a master politician. But he was able to do it. And Meacham is dealing with this century of 1865 to 1965, and he's choosing to end with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And this, again, what I've said a couple of times now, the concentrated work of citizens, what they can achieve when they intersect with the attention and skill of those in power. And it's somewhat remarkable that LBJ, a politician from Texas, finishes the work of Lincoln and JFK, and with regard to JFK and the Civil Rights Act, without changing a comma. And again, the greatest moments have been when a president changes his mind, and despite his Southern influences, as well as his previous track record of always changing legislation and getting his hands into every comma and changing, putting his imprint on it. Here he doesn't do that. He puts through the Civil Rights Act just as Kennedy had proposed it. So we get to the end of the book, where Meacham turns to us, the American citizen, and talks of what he sees as the first duty of the American citizen. And he breaks it down into these 5 points: to enter the arena, resist tribalism, respect facts, find a critical balance, and keep history in mind. But watching the documentary, he adds on this. He kind of flushes it out a little bit more than he does perhaps in the book. If we go to the next screen, he also adds through that documentary that the characteristics of leadership and citizenship include curiosity, right? Listen to one another. Humility, to admit mistakes. And if we were to go back to at the very beginning, the better angels, right? Having the humility to admit that as human beings, we are imperfect and we will make those mistakes. That too is part of the better angels, not that insistence that we know what's right. Meacham, towards the end of his book, he talks about the treasury of virtue in the North. I think he's quoting from Robert Warren Penn, author, who wrote of both the lost cause, but also as a negative, but also that the North comes out of the experience of Reconstruction and so many other experiences afterwards is having this treasury of virtue, which I had never heard that phrase before, and I think it's something that we in the North have to think about from time to time, that we are a nation and these problems are national problems. But I love this quote. I think these come from the documentary more so than the book. But speaking to us today, that too often today we react to things because of where we stand, not because of what they are. And attached to that, that when we don't look at ideas, things for what they are, when we don't engage with the text, the less we engage with the text, the more we engage emotionally and unreasonably too often. Meacham would say that our greatness as a country is our ability to reason, but also to be empathetic and to permit compromise. Meacham tells that wonderful story of President Bush, number one, about with the collapse of the Soviet Union and how President Bush was able to empathize with Gorbachev and to understand the situation that he was in, and to understand that to empathize with who had been our enemy, was to protect our national security, was the best for our national security. So to permit compromise is also part of the American genius, although compromise of principle is perhaps more of the darker side. Are we at the end, Debbie?
We are at the end. I'm going to stop sharing right now. And actually, I'm just want to share one other thing because I did have a request from someone to, you'll excuse me for doing this manually, but it's easier than stopping the share at this point. There was someone who asked to see this very first quote here about the 300 pages, wanted us to repeat the quote or statement on broad historical narrative in 300 pages is a great synthesis. So this is for you, the person who requested that. And did you want to speak to that at all anymore, John, or?
Well, I just enjoyed the book immensely because when I was teaching, I would talk to the students about, as that other quote, the importance of history. But the importance of our history, and not just the importance of our history to ourselves, but also to human beings at large. And to think of the country, the nation, right? A nation is a group of people. And if you think of a nation as, I think Meacham is somewhat suggesting that we think of the soul as we would the soul of a person. So the country has a soul. If we think of all of us individuals as kind of the cells of the country, and some cells are no longer with us and new cells are being born every day, but so that person changes, that country changes with the people, but it also remains the same, just as we lose our cells, but we are who we are from 10 years ago to 10 years forward. And to understand that the story of the American nation is a story of struggle. Meacham would call it, the battle of our better angels. So struggle to live up to as Martin Luther King said, the true meaning of our creed, that all men are created equal. It's been a struggle, and it continues to be a struggle. It's a struggle in part against self-interest that sees much of this story as a zero-sum game. If someone loses, if someone gains, I lose. But it's a beautiful story. And when I read this book, I learned so much in terms of the stories of, like, Truman reading the Bill of Rights to that woman, stories about every one of the presidents that I had never known of before. I learned so much about history, and it just enriched my understanding and love for our country, our nation. So I do agree that what he achieved bordered on the supernatural. It's a remarkable book, and if I were still teaching, I'd be advocating everybody to read it.
Thank you so much, John. That in itself is a great endorsement for this book because of your extensive background. I'm going to stop the share now. And since we're not, we're a fairly large group, but we're not exceptionally large, I think that we can, if you want to put in the chat, if you'd like to ask a question, if you'd like to be unmuted, you can just pop into the chat there. I'll be watching it, and we can have any discussion. I know some of you have sent questions ahead of time, so we addressed some of those questions in the presentation, but if you have others that our discussion has sparked, please feel free to note in the chat, or if you want to indicate in another way that you'd like to speak. Yeah. We'll give everybody a few minutes to, not everybody has quick fingers, so we'll give it a few minutes. Okay.
May I
so
ask a
Eric.
question?
Yes, Eric,
Yeah.
please.
Since you mentioned the power of John Meacham's synthesis, 300 pages for 300 years of American history or so, and you mentioned our creed, which is that all men are created equal, or all people are created equal, which is from the Bible, which is also a very condensed historical synthesis of the world. What do you make of the fact that John Meacham is the historian at the Washington Cathedral, which is an Episcopal denomination, when the founding fathers were worried about one denomination being more dominant than the other, which is why they did a sort of a separation of church and state. So can you comment on that? Because he is the historian, apparently, of the Washington National Cathedral, which I love very much, but it is representative of one denomination.
Great question.
Did I do my video?
I just in terms of, separation of church and state. Yeah, but for the fact that Meacham is holding a position of advisor to the president, I'm not sure if it's to what extent he's being paid, or I'm not sure the extent of his role. But I'd say that because of that fact, that he has that nexus to the government, you raise a point that is certainly one that is not frivolous. I'm not sure what the any benefit that is gained by the Episcopalian faith, but I'd be willing to listen. But I have to tell you, I haven't given that question any thought. I was not even aware of his association with the National Cathedral. But of course, I'll say this: the Supreme Court has a pretty important First Amendment separation case coming up this term, coming out of the state of Maine, with the use of public funds for students who choose to go to a parochial school. Sorry, I can't say much more about your question.
So John, I have a comment here in the chat from Holly, who says, while continuing in several roles at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, Meacham will devote his time at the cathedral to preaching, leading discussions with clergy and thought leaders, and contributing to its mission at the intersection of the sacred and the civic, according to the cathedral's release. During the pandemic, events led by Meacham will be offered to the public through the cathedral's YouTube channel. So just as another bit of information on his being involved with the Vanderbilt University, his roles there as well.
That issue, that part of the Constitution, of course, the wall of separation comes from a letter of Jefferson. It's not written into the Constitution. And the intent, as understood by the Supreme Court, is for the government not to place its thumb on the scale for any religion, to favor a religion. And of course, it comes out of a tradition of tax dollars being used to pay for the established religion of a colony then state, and to stop those types of practices. And of course, also a history of the dark side in terms of the persecution of people like the Quakers and others. So I'd have to give that a lot more thought before I'd be able to say if I think that there's a real issue there. Certainly, we don't expect our presidents to be non-religious. We welcome their faith, regardless of their particular sect. But we
So moving from the author to back to the book, I have a question here from Dana, who says, there are so many great quotes in this book from Meacham, certainly, but also from his subjects. One of my favorites was from Truman. I've wondered why the next generation can't profit from the generation before, but they never do until they get knocked in the head by experience. I suppose Meacham is trying to help us learn without the pain of getting knocked in the head. And so we have
give them
a,
hell, Harry.
I'm sorry, what?
Well, I was just thinking, what came to mind is, Harry Truman, give him hell, Harry. Tell it like it is. But that is a great quote. I certainly concur, and there are so many quotes that I truly enjoy, because I like the storytelling where you are drawing upon speeches, primary sources, letting the individual speak for themselves.
And Carrie has commented here, Meacham does a lot of self-deprecating humor almost daily on MSNBC, Morning Joe, so it's not surprising of, how he writes. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think I liked it in the documentary. It gave you a little bit of a better sense of who he is as a man, when his wife says, when she first met him, I forget, he was in his early 20s, maybe 19. She thought he was more like 30. I think it was someone at Newsweek mentioned how even as a young man, he had a certain waddle to his walk that reminded one of someone of a older generation, that he's
Yeah, I hope everybody got a chance to watch. That was great, John, that you shared with us the link for the documentary. I know I look at him entirely differently now after watching the documentary. I hope a lot of you did. We sent the link out beforehand. And also the wonderful Annenberg, the mandate video. Those were great adjuncts to this.
Yeah, and that mandate video is a very good one, and Edinburgh has a number of videos on there that are accessible, that are very good. What I find so interesting and why I wanted to suggest that video was because of the change that takes place from Jackson up to Lincoln. And Lincoln, they make the point in that video that sometimes our most dangerous presidents are our best presidents. And the reason the individual made that point was because they expand powers for good, as Lincoln did with his war powers, that could then, with a future president, that power might be used for bad. And that came to mind, when Lincoln came, and I apologize for all of these backs and forths, but when Lincoln made that speech, his first inaugural, it's so eloquent, but it didn't work. Right? Eloquence does not translate into efficacy. The war happened 5 weeks later. Right? Better angels did not win. And then he starts using war powers, including ultimately the power that he would claim to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. That comes up again in both that video, as well as I think in the documentary, when FDR, no, it's in the book also, when FDR, his first inaugural, he makes the point, not only, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, but also that point that he's going to ask for war powers. And Eleanor Roosevelt was struck by that. She was struck by the fact that the crowd reacted so positively to that, where she interpreted it, given the times, that they were quite open to someone wielding the power of a dictator. And certainly Lincoln was referred to as a dictator because of his use of war powers that previously had not existed.
John, I think you need to pick your dog up and give him a snuggle, because no one knows what's going on. I know what's going on. He's got a sad little guy there that needs a snuggle, or he's going to make a lot of noise. So,
Sorry.
oh, that's okay. Now he'll be quiet.
So that war powers, so in that video mandate, it makes the point that the presidency has changed, and it also points out how Lincoln's election in 1860 was the first election where the choice of electors was as we do it today, with winner take all. It's under Jackson that you have, along with universal white male suffrage, you have states changing their laws so that people, the popular vote, will decide the electors from that particular state. But it's not until you get to 1860 election that it's winner take all. And when Lincoln delivers his most famous address, his Gettysburg Address, and he speaks of not wanting government of the people, by the people, for the people, to perish from the earth, he's referring there to the fact, there's two ways of looking at that, at least two. One is that what the South was doing with the Civil War by seceding or attempting to secede was just saying, we don't have to abide by majority rule. And if you don't abide by majority rule, well, the minority can always then just secede. And that, if that happens, democracy is dead. You have to abide by majority rule and the rules of our politics, our Constitution. The other way of looking at that is he prefaced that statement with his new birth of freedom, because the original sin of the country, the bad sides, worst action, was slavery. I mean, Jefferson knew what he was writing was hypocritical as a slave owner when he talked about all men being created equal, when he spoke about government getting its authority from the consent of the governed. He knew he was putting in place the rationale for slave rebellion that he could not say would not be justified. So when Lincoln says a new birth of freedom is what will keep government of the people, by the people, for the people from perishing, we are now moving toward what we wouldn't achieve until 1965. We are now moving towards being a true republic where all of the people, right, will have a voice, where all of the people cannot make the argument that they are being deprived of their rights by the majority. But the South will make that argument. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the other comments here. Jill has said, I think a writer can be multidimensional and be able to write without a religious veneer. Carrie agreed and said in terms of his preacherliness. So I personally am not experiencing Meacham's writing point of view as overly imbued with religiosities or overvaluing such with our varied POTUS. He's describing, he's a historian. And then Dana says, speaking of the need for humility, I appreciated Meacham's musings on what behaviors, beliefs we find commonplace today will be aberrant to societies of the future. And then there's another comment here from Carrie. I just came from Heinz Plaza, January 6th vigil, and to Dana's observation, some of today's recent behaviors are obviously abhorrent to some civil, liberal, democratic societies of the future. We can only hope through action that we have such. And so it's sparked a lot of discussion here tonight on what are our better angels and what would we leave for the future?
Yeah, what is, you can open it up to think about current events, but certainly the very real movement by, I think, a dozen or so states to pass significant restrictions on voting is something that, to my mind, can only be addressed one of two ways, right? On the state level, which maybe the horse is out of the barn already there, but with addressing it through federal legislation. And of course, we had a Voting Rights Act of 1965 that would not have allowed any of these laws, at least to my knowledge, most, if not all, to go into effect without pre-approval by the federal government. That was the section of the Voting Rights Act that was gutted, is the word, by a Supreme Court decision. And surprisingly, it has not been addressed by Congress. Surprisingly, but maybe not so surprising, right? Our Congress is not functioning the way we would hope, I think. But we have that playing out, which is something that I think if Meacham were to be writing this book 10 years from now, it would be an example of something, either the better angels or dark impulses.
A lot to speculate here. I mean, I guess that's what the best books do for us is, make us think, make us look at other sides of things. And if anyone else has any comments they would like to share, otherwise we'll.
I would just say one thing, I would encourage, I'd love to hear any other favorite quotes or things that made you stop and say, wow, I didn't know that. But I'm also thinking about McCarthyism, and didn't spend any real time on McCarthy, even though Meacham says there is much we can learn from that. And I would say one of the more interesting parts of his telling the story was the role of journalism and how McCarthy not only manipulated it, he knew all of the deadlines that the reporters had to keep to, but also how I believe it was the editor of the Denver Post, man by the name of Palmer, I think, or Hoyt, but in any event, how he said, journalism has to investigate whether or not any of the claims of Senator McCarthy are valid, whether they're truthful, whether they are factual. And that, today I think part of our debate is the role of the press. Certainly, it's one of our important institutions. And I'm thinking of the last book we read, E.B. White. How there's just one of the great things of our free press is that there's just so much of it. And one of the duties of citizenship is to wade your way through it all and figure it out for yourself, but you have access to all of this information. And I think with McCarthy and today, we perhaps, just talking for myself, we maybe expect a little bit more as the Denver Post was expecting from its journalists to verify.
I'm sorry, Liza makes a point here. It seems to me that the technology and media communications we use now that are instantaneous and widespread do not seem to allow the rise and promotion of politicians and representatives who possess the characteristics we need. I guess that speaks to the fact that everything's so quick, and Twitter, and he even said that McCarthy would have loved Twitter, if they had it in his day, right? And also in here, Dana has said, I was thinking more like 100 years from now, will people dealing with climate change take down statues of our contemporaries known to have large carbon footprints? Frequent flyers, for example, who knows? And then Carrie said, that's thought-provoking. We really don't have contemporary statues, metaphorically or otherwise, but we have 99 years to go. And then we've got a lot going on here in the chat. Liza said the gotcha nature of press makes it very difficult for politicians to change their mind. Compromise has become a dirty word.
You don't want to be a flip-flopper.
Right. There was someone famous who was called a flip-flopper.
Maybe, Meacham's point about changing our minds is part of what makes us great, right? And we shouldn't be afraid of that. And fear plays into this for politicians, just as it did in the McCarthy era, fear of the base. And Meacham says for presidents, they have to reach out beyond, they have to be willing to reach out beyond their base, to listen, to realize, right? And to act as though they are 24/7, 365 days a year, for 4 years at least, they are in office. It's not the same, yes, they're in office, but Congress goes out of session, in session. And at the time of Lincoln, Congress was only in session from December until the following March. So when Lincoln took office, there was no Congress sitting in Washington, D.C., which was part of the reason he was able to, or reason why he had to, seize some of the powers that he seized. Congress is in office, or is in session, much more so now than they were then, but they are still not. They are constantly the way the way our president is constantly on duty. I'm not sure
Great
why.
discussion, really great discussion. So much to think about. And we're kind of out of time right now. We don't want to keep everyone too long. Oh, and the final question here, Carrie says, social media gotchas, so much of a stranglehold on our world that wasn't predictable even remotely by our framers and founders, and wants to know, has anyone read or seen What the Constitution Means to Me? That was recently at McCarter and some other places. So that's another conversation for another time, but yeah, that's very timely as well. So thank you, John. Any final words or?
Read the Constitution. It's such an important document, but don't forget that we also have a state constitution. Sometimes we can lose sight of the fact that the state government impacts our life perhaps more so than the federal government does. Although our focus is through the media, which is largely national, but we do have our state media as well. don't lose sight of that.
Well,
But I apologize. I know I went through very quickly, very rapidly, and it's a book that anybody who wants to just meet for a cup of coffee and talk more, let me know.
very nice of you. And so we'll be meeting again for our civics book discussion group in March. We are not revealing titles yet, but you will all hear about it once we do. And you'll be also getting a survey following this. So thank you again, John, for everything, for really enlightening us and bringing so many things for us to think about and discuss, particularly now. And we thank you again. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you enormously, everybody. Happy, hopeful New Year.
Happy New
Thank
Year.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, good night.